John Caleb Bradberton watched the sunset bleed across the Boston skyline, the orange pollution haze reflecting perfectly off the polished mahogany of his executive suite. It was October 2077, and the world was screaming toward its inevitable conclusion. A fact Bradberton ignored with the practiced ease of a man who believed his product could outlive civilization itself. He swirled the contents of the glass in his hand, a deep, caramel-colored liquid that shimmered with an unnatural luminescence. This was batch 304 Alpha, the culmination of a decade of relentless, paranoid refinement, and it still wasn't right. "It's the finish, Doctor," Bradberton murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that rarely needed to be raised to command attention. He addressed Dr. Quentin, the lead chemist, a man whose permanent tremor suggested a long-term, intimate relationship with industrial solvents. The initial rush is peerless. The citric acid explosion, the sugar saturation, it hits the pleasure centers like a rail spike. But the decay is too swift. I need the consumer to crave the next sip before the last one has even fully registered. Dr. Quentin adjusted his thick, black-rimmed glasses, the fluorescent light of the lab coat reflecting weakly in the darkening room. "Mr. Bradberton, we are already pushing the legal limits on sucrose and caffeine concentration. We've incorporated trace elements of 19 different fruit extracts, guarana, and the synthetic vanilla compound, vanilloid 7. To extend the linger requires structural alteration at the molecular level of the flavoring agents." Bradberton dismissed the technical jargon with a sharp flick of his wrist. "Then alter it. I didn't hire the brightest minds on the eastern seaboard to tell me what the FDA permits. I hired you to produce the most addictive, most profitable beverage in human history. The competition is stagnant, Quentin. Sunset sarsaparilla is a geriatrics drink. Vim is a regional anomaly. Nuka-Cola must be ubiquitous, essential, a metabolic requirement. The true secret, the one that kept Quentin awake at night, wasn't the sugar content, it was merely the delivery vehicle. It was the experimental additive Bradberton had demanded 3 years ago, codenamed Project Aurora. It was a synthetic compound, highly energetic, designed originally for early fusion research, now repurposed to provide a clean, almost electric zing to the cola's profile. It had zero caloric value, but interacted violently with the existing flavor matrix, locking the sweet and sour notes onto the taste receptors for far longer than any natural compound could manage. The side effects in laboratory rats had been concerning: hyperactivity, rapid cellular decay, and an unnerving, single-minded focus on the source of the compound. Bradberton, of course, had simply noted the rats' persistent desire for the drink and authorized immediate human trials, disguised as routine taste tests among low-level employees. "We achieved the required retention time with compound SR90, Quentin admitted, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. "It provides the sustained electrical sensation you requested, Mr. Bradberton. It binds to the flavor molecules, preventing rapid dissolution. We saw a 140% increase in perceived flavor duration in the last panel." Bradberton leaned forward, his eyes gleaming in the half-light. "SR90. Simple, elegant. And the sourcing? It is synthesized from a proprietary blend of minerals, including a highly purified isotope, stable enough for ingestion in these trace amounts. It's expensive, but highly effective. We are currently stockpiling the raw materials at the bottling plant in Kitty Kingdom, well away from any EPA oversight." Quentin's voice dropped to a near whisper. "The half-life on the primary isotope is manageable in the trace amounts, but the cumulative effect on the human nervous system over a decade of consumption is unknown." The name SR90 tasted sharp and clean on Bradberton's tongue. It wasn't just a flavor enhancer. It was a physical sensation, a mild, sustained energetic charge that mimicked euphoria. It was the key to unlocking the true market potential. The public wouldn't just enjoy Nuka-Cola. They would require it to feel alive, Excellent, Doctor. Prepare the final production run. We will call the new formula Nuka-Cola Quantum. Double the standard flavoring, triple the SR90 concentration. I want the consumer to see the energy, to feel the glow. Make it irresistible. Make it unforgettable. Bradberton didn't need to ask about the long-term health risks. He didn't care. The final, perfect product was now within his grasp, a shimmering blue beverage that promised vitality while secretly delivering a slow, delicious decay. The world was about to end, but Nuka-Cola would ensure that humanity went out craving one last, perfect radioactive sip. The patent applications for the new formula, deceptively filed under novel flavor retention metrics, were already being rushed through the compromised channels of the Commerce Department, ensuring that the secret of the glow would remain locked behind a wall of corporate espionage and political payoff. The blue light was not just marketing. It was the physical manifestation of addiction, bottled and sold for 75 cents. The initial batch of Quantum was mixed under extreme caution, though the caution was purely for maintaining the product's integrity, not the safety of the chemists. The blue light was blindingly intense, a deep sapphire luminescence that seemed to defy the laws of natural coloration. It wasn't merely a dye. It was the light emitted by the decaying SR90 atoms, a subtle, trapped Cherenkov radiation effect scaled down to the molecular level, held suspended within the high fructose corn syrup and citric acid matrix. When the first bottles rolled off the specialized bottling line, they didn't just reflect ambient light, they actively projected it, illuminating the sterile white laboratory walls with an ethereal, pulsing energy that seemed to hum with latent power. Quentin watched the process with a mixture of professional awe and profound moral horror. He knew he had created a perfect poison, one that tasted indistinguishable from victory. The flavor profile was a violent collision of extreme, almost aggressive sweetness and a sharp, metallic citric acid bite, immediately followed by the electric jolt of the SR90 compound. It felt, physically, like sticking one's tongue directly onto a 9-volt battery, yet the sensation was instantly pleasurable, overriding the body's natural rejection mechanisms. Test subjects, primarily older janitorial staff and newly hired interns lured by the promise of substantial extra pay, reported an immediate, almost manic surge of energy. Their pupils dilated rapidly, their heart rates spiked to dangerous, unsustainable levels, and they universally demanded a second bottle the moment the first was finished, exhibiting the exact single-minded focus Bradberton had observed in the laboratory rats. Their hands trembled, not from cold, but from an overdose of artificial kinetic energy coursing through their suddenly overtaxed vascular systems. The physiological response was instant and overwhelming. The SR90 acted as a hyper-efficient, non-caloric energy delivery system, forcing the body to burn its existing reserves at an unsustainable, accelerated rate, leaving the user temporarily brilliant but ultimately hollowed out. The Kitty Kingdom bottling plant, a sprawling, cheerfully dilapidated amusement park Bradberton had acquired years prior for pennies on the dollar, became the clandestine heart of quantum production. Its remote location and the existing maze of deep, rarely inspected underground maintenance tunnels made it the ideal location for handling the volatile raw materials. Massive, heavily reinforced lead-line storage tanks, discreetly installed beneath the carousel and the abandoned roller coaster tracks, held the purified SR-90 concentrate. The isotope arrived in sealed, triple-layered casks labeled innocuously as flavoring agent 7X, or sometimes industrial-grade solvents. The security detail, a private force recruited from disgraced military contractors and veterans with no loyalty to civilian government agencies, ensured that no EPA or Department of Health official ever got close enough to register the faint, persistent clicking of Geiger counters that permeated the facility's lower levels, a constant, low-level warning that the air filtration system struggled to completely suppress. The most dangerous operation, however, was the disposal of the irradiated byproducts. Spent catalysts and residual SR-90 sludge, heavy and intensely hot, were sealed in custom-fabricated ceramic drums. These drums were then lowered into the deepest, decommissioned maintenance shafts beneath the park's defunct Tunnel of Thrills ride, sealed with reinforced concrete. This was Bradberton's temporary solution, a ticking environmental time bomb buried beneath the cheerful facade of a forgotten playground, ensuring that the contamination remained localized and undetectable, at least for now. The air in the mixing rooms smelled metallic, sharp, and slightly ozone-like, a constant, chemical reminder of the unstable elements being integrated into the sugary base. The technicians, outfitted in heavy, proprietary radiation shielding that Bradberton insisted they refer to publicly as enhanced thermal suits for plausible deniability, worked grueling, heavily monitored shifts. Their movements were slow and deliberate, knowing that a single catastrophic spill of the concentrate could irradiate the entire surrounding county, rendering the area uninhabitable for decades. Bradberton had calculated the risk-reward ratio with chilling precision. The cost of specialized shielding, automated systems, and hazard pay was negligible compared to the billions he stood to make from the global distribution of his blue elixir. He commissioned a highly specialized, completely automated bottling line that minimized human interaction with the final, highly charged product. The bottles themselves required a slightly thicker, proprietary glass formulation to contain the increased internal pressure generated by the rapid atomic decay and subsequent chemical reaction, and the sapphire tint was permanent, baked directly into the glass itself to enhance the visual effect of the liquid's inherent glow. This wasn't merely soda. It was weaponized refreshment, manufactured within a funhouse facade. The Kitty Kingdom site was a testament to Bradberton's ability to mask toxic ambition with saccharine nostalgia. The launch campaign for Nuka-Cola Quantum was a masterpiece of mid-century psychological manipulation, leveraging the public's obsession with atomic power and the future. Advertisements plastered across every billboard and television screen promised the future you can drink, featuring impossibly energetic families glowing faintly blue under the midday sun, their eyes wide with manic, artificial vitality. The slogan, "See the energy, taste the glow," became an instant cultural touchstone, driving immediate, unprecedented demand. The marketing wasn't selling a beverage. It was selling an identity, a refusal to accept the mundane limits of human endurance. Bradberton ensured that every piece of promotional material subtly reinforced the drink's scarcity and elite status, creating an artificial sense of competitive urgency among consumers. The sapphire bottle itself was engineered to feel heavy and substantial in the hand, signaling quality and power, a physical manifestation of the atomic future they were promised, reinforcing the immediate visceral connection between the glowing liquid and the feeling of absolute control. On launch day, queues snaked around city blocks. Consumers were instantly captivated by the drink's unique visual appeal. It was a novelty, a high-status symbol, a liquid light source that physically changed the way they perceived their environment. But the true genius was the SR-90's insidious effect on the neurological architecture. The initial euphoric rush was so pronounced that drinkers immediately associated the blue glow with peak performance, absolute mental clarity, and overwhelming physical vitality. They didn't feel the subtle, insidious damage occurring at the cellular level. They only felt the immediate, overwhelming, and non-negotiable need for more. After just a few weeks of regular consumption, the drinkers began to experience a dulling of normal, natural flavors. Regular foods, steak, coffee, fresh fruit all tasted flat, muted, and lifeless. Only the extreme, electric, hyperstimulation of SR-90 could register with the now overstimulated and slightly chemically damaged taste buds. This was the mechanism of sustained addiction. The product didn't just satisfy a craving. It systematically created the necessary physiological environment where only quantum could satisfy any craving, locking the consumer into a cycle of dependence. Quentin spent sleepless nights reviewing the raw telemetry data, the graphs showing the exponential degradation of renal function and the alarming spikes in white blood cell counts among the test groups. He saw the future of the consumer base mapped out in sterile Excel sheets, a generation of hyperstimulated, chemically dependent invalids. His attempts to subtly adjust the formula adding stabilizing agents, increasing the concentration of harmless B vitamins, were instantly flagged and vetoed by Bradburton's automated monitoring systems, leaving Quentin trapped in a gilded cage, the architect of a catastrophe he could not halt. Quentin, now officially the director of flavor science, but perpetually haunted by the internal reports, tried to raise concerns about the increasingly observed neurological corrosion minor, persistent tremors, premature cataracts, and a worrying tendency toward irrational aggression and severe mood swings among the heaviest users. Bradburton dismissed the reports as statistically insignificant noise related to pre-existing conditions or typical urban stress. He rationalized his actions with cold, uncompromising logic. The world was spiraling toward thermonuclear war. Anyway, global resources were finite, and the political climate was toxic and unstable. If humanity was destined to end in fire and dust, why shouldn't they spend their final years feeling utterly, brilliantly alive, powered by his perfect blue elixir? He saw himself not as a mass poisoner, but as a temporary, necessary savior, providing a beautiful, glowing anesthetic against the grim, encroaching reality of the apocalypse. The patent protection, filed under the deceptively benign, novel flavor retention matrix, was airtight, secured by a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts in neutral territories. The final, critical detail that ensured consumer loyalty was the inclusion of trace, subclinical amounts of a mild, proprietary nerve agent, just enough to slightly impede the adrenal glands, ability to effectively regulate stress responses and cortisol levels. This ensured that the consumer felt a constant, low-level, unidentifiable anxiety, a persistent hum of dissatisfaction that only the immediate, overwhelming rush of the SR90 and Quantum could temporarily silence and override. The blue glow was the literal light of the future, radiating from the core of a beautiful engineered lie, promising vitality and immortality while secretly delivering a carefully calibrated dose of slow, sweet oblivion. Every bottle sold was a nail in the coffin of natural human experience, replaced by the persistent, humming, chemical need for the next electric saccharine hit. Bradburton watched the news feeds from his soundproofed penthouse office. Sipping a glass of iced water, he never touched the product, a thin, satisfied smile playing on his lips. The stock price was vertical, soaring past all analyst projections. The taste of SR90, the taste of ultimate, undeniable control, was the sweetest flavor he had ever known. The proprietary nerve agent, Lazarus Hum, was engineered not to harm, but to persistently inconvenience the human psyche, rendering baseline existence subtly intolerable. It targeted GABA receptors responsible for dampening hypervigilance and maintaining emotional equilibrium, specifically downregulating the capacity for endogenous pleasure derived from simple environmental stimuli. The hum generated a subtle, persistent background static, a low-frequency dread that amplified inherent existential anxiety, rooting itself deep within the limbic system, where it systematically eroded the capacity for future planning and meaningful self-reflection. This chemically induced dissatisfaction drove the exponential growth of the Nuka-Cola economy, transforming a luxury good into a psychological necessity. The hum was the perfect corporate weapon, convincing the consumer the problem was internal, a failing of their constitution, a fundamental lack of personal fortitude, rather than a calculated, slow-acting chemical assault. It generated a phantom ache for a past that never existed, ensuring the aggressive, overwhelming sweetness of Nuka-Cola was perceived not as a recreational treat, but as a necessary biological antidote to an otherwise unbearable reality. Consumers didn't merely crave the saccharine rush. They required the instantaneous, overwhelming sensory ablation provided by the SR90 complex, which temporarily flooded the system with artificial euphoria, overriding the PNA's grip. The SR90 complex, a highly volatile, synthesized compound delivered dopamine, norepinephrine, and sucrose directly to the nucleus accumbens, creating a neurological event so powerful it momentarily reset the user's perception of reality, offering a brief, blinding escape from the hum's constant pressure. The duration of this relief was calibrated with ruthless precision, long enough to feel necessary and life-affirming, yet short enough to guarantee the consumer's desperate need for the next purchase within a 4-hour window, ensuring maximum daily consumption cycles. This engineered crash created a neurological debt that exceeded the initial discomfort, meaning the user was always chasing a feeling of normalcy that the product itself had systematically destroyed. The agent eroded the capacity for simple contentment, replacing it with a nagging, consuming desire for more, ensuring every quiet moment was filled with commercial necessity, defining the very rhythm of daily life by the ticking clock of chemical depletion. The physiological withdrawal symptoms, though mild, were perfectly designed to mimic acute, paralyzing anxiety, ensuring compliance and repeat transactions. Quentin, trapped in his sterile, brightly lit subterranean lab, felt the sterile fear closing in, compounded by the relentless, synthesized smell of ozone and cherry flavoring that clung to his skin and hair, marking his moral compromise like a chemical tattoo. The atmosphere was perpetually chilled to precisely 65 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature scientifically proven to inhibit relaxation and maximize cortisol production. He attempted to synthesize advanced chelating agents to bind to the heavy metal contaminants, specifically cadmium and lead at Bradburton, introduced to extend shelf life and enhance the product's signature metallic aftertaste, hoping to mitigate escalating renal damage reports that were being buried under layers of corporate obfuscation. He spent sleepless weeks reverse engineering the security lockdown on the central mixing apparatus, working under the oppressive glare of lighting, calibrated specifically to a non-relaxing wavelength that suppressed melatonin production, ensuring a state of perpetual, low-grade alertness and fatigue. Any modification outside Bradburton's defined acceptable parameters, anything that increases consumption rate or visual appeal, triggered an immediate, deafening shutdown of the production line and an encrypted alert to Bradburton's orbital monitoring system, Icarus. This system was not merely a surveillance network. It was an automated, sentient guardian of the formula, capable of initiating a cascade failure, a total destruction of the plant and all its inhabitants, with zero human intervention. Quentin realized his title, Director of Flavor Science, was a cruel joke, and his true role was Chief Custodian of the Poison, a highly paid jailer of a formula he desperately wished to dismantle. The only projects permitted were purely cosmetic, maximizing the cerulean hue and perfecting the carbonation level to deliver the precise, painful sting essential to the shock of pleasure. He spent weeks adjusting the supercritical carbon dioxide injection process, achieving a bubble-sized distribution calibrated to maximize trigeminal nerve stimulation. A physiological assault masquerading as refreshment, engineered to distract the consumer from the creeping dread of the hum. The goal was not refreshment, but sensory overload, a momentary neurological circuit breaker. Bradburton viewed the masses not as individuals, but as thermodynamic systems requiring controlled energy input and output. Internal reports of Nuka-Rage, explosive, unpredictable violence following heavy consumption and subsequent SR90 crash were filed under the clinical designation social friction. He saw this not as a product failing, but as irrefutable proof of efficiency, a system shedding excess, unstable heat. He dictated a confidential memo, suggesting a national campaign focusing on the energy of action, rebranding, aggression and irritability as initiative and ambition, a fundamental societal re-engineering, where explosive irritability was marketed as the necessary precondition for commercial success and personal drive. The violence became a feature, not a bug, an externalization of the chemically induced internal conflict. Bradberton sat 40 floors above the smog. The air in his penthouse filtered through a specialized HEPA system that scrubbed out every trace of exhaust and the sickeningly sweet, cloying scent of the bottling plants below. He never consumed Nuka-Cola. His absolute, unchallenged control over the formula and the market provided a pure, more intoxicating form of power, a psychological high far superior to the transient dopamine rush he sold to the masses. His intoxication was the continuous realization that every purchase, every moment of chemically induced anxiety, every explosion of Nuka rage below was a direct, predictable consequence of his will, a perfect, self-sustaining economic machine. The crystal glass of iced water he perpetually held was a deliberate, ascetic choice, a constant visual reminder, held aloft like a chalice, that while the world gorged itself on his carefully engineered poison, he remained clean, sober, and the unchallenged master manipulator, watching the gears turn from his isolated, pristine perch. The Icarus system, housed in a server rack behind his desk, hummed softly, a mechanical extension of his consciousness, monitoring the global flow of his product, ensuring no deviation from the profit-maximizing formula. The vibrant, ethereal blue luminescence of Nuka-Cola Quantum was the signature of the strontium-90 isotope, present in trace, yet biologically significant, amounts. Bradberton engineered the process not just for color, but to ionize sugar molecules, causing them to emit cerulean radiation, a visually arresting spectacle. This was the true, insidious purpose of the novel flavor retention matrix. The radiation systematically and subtly altered the cellular structure of the tongue, causing a slow, systemic sensory burnout. The ionization process, which the corporation euphemistically termed chromatic flavor amplification, targeted the filiform papillae, causing chronic inflammation and microscarring that progressively dulled all non-ionized taste inputs, especially the subtle notes of natural foods like complex carbohydrates or fresh produce. The constant ionic bombardment ensured that all natural flavors registered as dull, flat, and fundamentally uninteresting. Only the overwhelming, syrupy assault of quantum, with its chemical and radiological enhancement, could now register as satisfying, or even fully perceived, by the damaged sensory organs. This chemical and radiological flavor monopoly ensured dependency by systematically destroying the biological capacity for natural enjoyment, making the consumer a prisoner of the product. The FDA, overwhelmed and thoroughly corrupted by the corporation's immense economic weight, had signed off on the process through a systematic campaign of political donations, compromised scientific committees, and a revolving door policy that ensured former executives became regulatory gatekeepers. Bradberton's manipulated data claimed the radiation was a bioluminescent marker, safely encapsulated and metabolically inert. The proprietary nature of the flavor retention matrix was guarded by layers of legal obfuscation and technological complexity, making independent analysis virtually impossible for external, uncompromised labs. The corporation's economic pull warped the regulatory environment, transforming oversight into complicity, ensuring the systematic destruction of the public palate went unchallenged under the guise of novel food science and intellectual property protection. The societal effects were impossible to ignore or categorize simply as side effects. Quantum tremors, a slight, rapid vibration of the hands, often dismissed as nervous energy, were an accepted idiosyncrasy of the workforce. Heavy users exhibited premature graying and waxy, translucent skin, their veins faintly visible and blue from chemical saturation and heavy metal accumulation. Children raised on the product exhibited a frightening lack of emotional regulation, cycling violently between ecstatic, short-lived highs and aggressive, inconsolable lows. Their attention spans collapsed entirely, requiring constant, overwhelming sensory input to maintain a fraction of focus. Bradberton had weaponized happiness, turning joy into a fleeting, expensive commodity, accessible only through repeated, financially draining purchases. Culture defined personal success, not by achievement or stability, but by the ability to afford the next necessary dose of euphoria, pushing the impoverished further into a cycle of chemically induced despair. Quentin watched a news report flickering on a monitor in his lab, showing a queue stretching 5 city blocks for the latest limited edition flavor, Atomic Sunset. The crowd vibrated with palpable desperation, their eyes wide and unfocused, reflecting the shimmering, terrifying blue glow of the massive Nuka-Cola billboards towering above them. Bradberton knew the taste of ultimate control was the sweetest flavor, ready to savor the world he had engineered into perfect, perpetual dependency, a vast, anxious market he owned entirely. The relentless, chemically mandated demand was his symphony, and the low, persistent hum of the Lazarus agent was its agonizing, profitable overture. The queue for Atomic Sunset was a pilgrimage of the biologically crippled, seeking mandatory chemical maintenance. Quentin watched the monitor, the blue light washing out his pallor. Desperate faces reflected the violent luminescence of the massive billboard. The dispensing stations hummed with the low-frequency thrum of industrial dependency. The raw desperation vibrating through the crowd was not desire, but a deep, cellular panic, the withdrawal symptoms of the Lazarus agent manifesting as aggressive anxiety that only the overwhelming saturation of quantum could temporarily quell. Quentin studied the schematics. The Lazarus agent, delivered subtly and ubiquitously in the classic Nuka-Cola formula, targeted the basal cells of the taste epithelium. It was a hyperaccelerant of apoptosis, specifically destroying the G-protein-coupled receptors in the critical type 2 taste cells responsible, for detecting natural sweetness and umami. This precision systematically dismantled the body's ability to communicate genuine nutritional satisfaction. The type 2 cells committed cellular suicide, leaving a scarred, non-responsive epithelium. This biological vandalism ensured the consumer's first interaction with real food was one of profound, inexplicable disappointment. Bradberton had irrevocably compromised the foundation of natural appetite recognition. This systematic pruning ensured that subtle, natural flavors, ripe fruit, aged meat, fresh vegetables were registered by the damaged sensory organs as faint, unsatisfying noise. The brain, starved of the necessary chemical signals to register genuine satiety, craved increasingly violent, overwhelming sensory inputs. The Lazarus agent achieved sensory atrophy by design, sterilizing the consumer's palate against any competitor lacking the same aggressive chemical profile. This systematic sensory deprivation created a void only extreme synthetic input could fill. The dullness was the weapon. The intense flavor was merely the distraction from the underlying biological catastrophe. Nuka-Cola Quantum became essential. Its syrupy, overwhelming saturation of synthesized flavors bridged the sensory gap, providing a stimulus so intense it bypassed the normal, now defunct sensory processing pathways. The crucial proprietary element was the flavor retention matrix, a hydrocarbon lattice doped with minute, regulated quantities of strontium-90 isotopes. Bradberton claimed it was a bioluminescent marker. In reality, the radiation acted as a potent cellular penetrant, modifying the permeability of the blood-brain barrier to accelerate the uptake of proprietary flavor molecule. This ensured the flavor slammed into the now sensitized, damaged neural pathways with maximum violent impact, forcing the brain to register the synthetic profile as an emergency signal of vital importance. The terrifying blue glow was the corporate signature of neurological warfare, indicating the chemical payload's radiological boost. Using strontium-90, a known bone seeker and carcinogen, was an act of calculated biological sabotage. Bradburton traded decades of consumer health for maximized addiction velocity. This was the dark calculus, leveraging the isotope's half-life against the consumer's lifespan. The matrix ensured the high was instantaneous, overwhelming, and short-lived, demanding immediate redosing as the heavily metabolized chemicals rapidly cleared the system. The radiological half-life became the physiological clock, dictating the rhythm of need and preventing recovery without severe, paralyzing discomfort. The legal defenses surrounding the matrix were impenetrable, classified under national security exemptions, and buried in decades of intellectual property obfuscation. Challenging Nuka-Cola's IP cost astronomically more than regulatory fines, effectively granting the corporation legal immunity for mass-scale physiological sabotage. The legal shield functioned as a deterrent. Any attempt to penetrate the flavor retention matrix classification was met with injunctions citing proprietary defense, protocols, and threats of national economic destabilization. Independent researchers who published conflicting findings were targeted with ruinous litigation, ensuring a climate of enforced scientific silence. Regulatory bodies, underfunded and overwhelmed, were neutralized, forced to accept Nuka-Cola's self-reported safety data. The system was rigged not just to protect the product, but to actively punish curiosity. Quentin traced the schematic, the neural maps showing the collapse of the nucleus accumbens feedback loop. The Lazarus agent had effectively rerouted the entire reward system. Natural dopamine release, triggered by genuine accomplishment or human connection, was now too weak to register against the chemically mandated baseline. The Nuka-Cola high was not a recreational bonus. It was the new minimum requirement for functioning sentience. This chemical dependency fundamentally re-engineered human motivation, rendering intrinsic reward systems obsolete. The quantum tremors were the physical manifestation of the central nervous system violently attempting to recalibrate in the absence of the heavy metal stabilizers and sugar shock. He noted the translucent, waxy skin and visible blue veins of heavy users' signs of systemic nutrient malabsorption and heavy metal saturation. The children were the most horrifying evidence. Their emotional landscape was flattened, their capacity for sustained, nuanced feeling replaced by binary extremes, either the aggressive manic ecstasy of a fresh dose or plunging into deep aggressive lethargy. They were inconsolable because the baseline of normal human sensation was gone. Their demand for constant, overwhelming sensory input was a desperate, involuntary attempt by their damaged brains to feel anything outside the chemical prison Nuka-Cola had constructed. Their dependence was foundational, a biological inheritance. The ultimate victory was creating a generation whose very capacity for joy was financially dependent on a single corporate entity. Societal acceptance of this widespread biological decay had successfully redefined normal. Corporate culture subtly encouraged quantum as a performance enhancer for its brief burst of hyperproductivity. The poor, unable to afford the frequent, stabilizing doses of quantum, relied on cheaper classic Nuka-Cola, perpetually stuck in low-grade withdrawal and chronic anxiety. Their chemical need dictated their economic output, trapping them as wage slaves, financing their next necessary fix. Low-grade withdrawal ensured constant inefficiency, justifying lower wages and reinforcing the cycle of dependency. The elite ensured the masses remained chemically reliant for both productivity and docility. Bradburton had engineered a self-sustaining economic ecosystem built on chemically mandated despair. Quentin zoomed in on the faces in the queue, seeing empty, wide eyes reflecting the blue light, not the eyes of people waiting for a treat, but the eyes of animals waiting for feed. The genius and the profound evil lay in the subtlety of the attack, sensory eradication disguised as hyperflavor. The Lazarus agent was the silent weapon, destroying the capacity for natural reward. Quantum was the expensive radioactive cure, ensuring perpetual revenue. Bradburton had achieved market dominance not by selling the best product, but by destroying the competition's ability to satisfy the consumer. When natural food tasted like ash and water, Nuka-Cola, however chemically overwhelming, became the only viable source of pleasure, and thus the only viable source of motivation. The constant chemical assault led to the permanent downregulation of serotonin and norepinephrine receptors, forcing the brain to rely solely on the massive dopaminergic surge provided by the complex sugar radiation interaction of quantum. The result was a neurological landscape of scorched earth, a subtle, nuanced connection between the olfactory bulb and the limbic system, a pathway responsible for memory and deep emotional association with flavor was severed. Consumers could no longer associate the smell of baking bread or fresh rain with comfort. Those connections had been chemically overwritten by the aggressive, synthetic blast of the latest Nuka-Cola iteration. The sensory world outside the bottle was fading, becoming muted, gray, and uninteresting. This systematic sensory deprivation was the true product, ensuring that the consumer's entire emotional and intellectual life narrowed down to the next moment of chemical relief. The hum of the Lazarus agent, low and persistent in the background of global consumption, was the sound of humanity's collective palate dying, a profitable, agonizing overture to the complete ownership of the human reward system. The systematic sensory deprivation was the true product, a surgical erasure of intrinsic motivation that narrowed the consumer's entire emotional and intellectual life down to the next moment of chemical relief. The persistent low hum of the Lazarus agent, often masked by upbeat jingles and bright, distracting advertisements, was not merely a side effect, but the profitable sound of humanity's collective palate dying, a controlled epidemic, generating predictable, recession-proof revenue streams through the complete, non-negotiable ownership of the human reward system. This hum was the sound of engineered despair, a constant subliminal reminder of the world's inadequacy without the proprietary cure. Quentin felt a cold dread at the scale of this neurological engineering, an act of biological terrorism masked as mass-market refreshment. The Lazarus agent functioned as a biological scorched earth policy, aggressively targeting the G protein-coupled receptors responsible for detecting subtle organic compounds. Bradburton's chemical assault ensured that the natural world, from fresh fruit to clean air, registered as an impoverished, low-resolution experience, a faded photograph compared to the vibrant, synthetic reality offered by the corporation. This structural impairment of chemisensory pathways led to permanent anosmia and hypogeusia, transcending mere tolerance and establishing a baseline of sensory poverty. The agent specifically downregulated TRPV1 receptors, creating a chronic, low-grade neurological inflammation, a constant background noise of sensory dissatisfaction, a persistent ache in the limbic system that only the overwhelming signal of Nuka-Cola could momentarily silence. Corporate memos euphemistically referred to this state as the sensory optimization protocol, a necessary pruning of irrelevant environmental data. Starved of meaningful natural input, the brain began to atrophy. Dendritic spines linked to olfaction and gustation retracted and withered, their function rendered obsolete by the chemical environment. Neuroplasticity was weaponized. Unused pathways were aggressively pruned, leaving a neural landscape optimized solely for the reception and processing of synthetic stimuli. This was the insidious victory, the eradication of contextual resonance. Sensory anchors, the complex, comforting smell of a first rainstorm on dry earth, the nuanced, earthy taste of a regional dish passed down through generations. The warning scent of smoke or decay were chemically neutralized, becoming inert. Meaningless data points incapable of triggering genuine emotional resonance or protective instinct. Cultural continuity, which relies heavily on shared sensory experiences, was rendered functionally meaningless. The capacity for complex, nuanced appreciation of art, nature, or even human interaction was chemically excised, leaving only the hunger for crude, overwhelming synthetic blasts. Even natural defense mechanisms, like visceral repulsion to decay, were dampened, forcing absolute reliance on corporate labeling and expiration dates for safety cues. Language itself became impoverished. Descriptors for flavor and aroma outside the corporate lexicon gradually faded from common usage, replaced by simplistic terms like sweet, blue, and fizz. This neurological vacuum was violently filled by the Nuka-Cola delivery system. The extreme acidity, hypersaturated artificial sweeteners, and the crucial proprietary blend of beryllium-7 and strontium-90 in quantum provided a chemical sledgehammer that completely bypassed the damaged, muted receptors. The radiation sugar complex acted as a massive non-specific agonist, flooding the remaining hypersensitive dopamine pathways in the nucleus accumbens with a crude, overwhelming signal. This is pleasure. This is the only pleasure available. This is survival. The resulting surge was a painful, necessary chemical correction, alleviating the deep-seated anxiety and profound emptiness induced by the low-grade withdrawal cycle. This system was perfectly self-reinforcing. Lazarus created the pain of sensory lack and the constant metabolic debt, and quantum provided the temporary, overwhelming relief, making the corporation the sole purveyor of psychological equilibrium and biochemical sovereignty. The inevitable sharp crash ensured the immediate renewal of the biological imperative to consume, often within the hour. Bradburton had perfected the economic application of chronic anxiety. Standard Nuka-Cola maintained sensory suppression and kept the withdrawal at bay, but lacked the radioactive kick necessary to fully correct the neurological damage. Consumers existed in a state of perpetually unsatisfied craving, a low-frequency hum of dissatisfaction that consumed cognitive bandwidth, inhibited focus, and severely curtailed long-term planning. This enforced inefficiency created ideal wage slaves, productive enough to earn their next dose, yet chemically incapable of organizing, critically analyzing their situation, or saving for future independence. Their intellectual energy was consumed entirely by the biological imperative for relief, enforcing a complete lack of future orientation that mirrored the corporation's obsessive focus on the immediate quarterly reporting cycle. The financial ecosystem was designed to exploit this, with microloan systems and product futures ensuring that the consumer was always paying for the next dose before they finished the last. The Nuka-Cola generation was biologically wired for immediate, quantifiable reward. Their capacity for sustained, non-rewarding effort was negligible, and their risk aversion, especially concerning anything that might interrupt supply, was astronomical. The political implications were stark. A population chemically mandated to docility, whose greatest fear was product interruption, not governmental overreach. Bradburton didn't need military control or explicit totalitarian laws. He had neurological consensus. Memos detailed the docility quotient, a metric measuring willingness to accept substandard living conditions, reduced civil liberties, and dangerous working environments in exchange for guaranteed product access. Data showed a direct correlation. Chemical impairment was a more effective tool for social engineering and the prevention of collective action than any political decree. Civil society institutions crumbled because abstract concepts like justice or liberty simply did not register on the chemically prioritized reward scale. The ultimate degradation was the severing of the limbic system's connection to the external environment. If the smell of fire, the taste of spoiled food, or the subtle chemical signals of a stressed environment no longer registered, the capacity for autonomous self-preservation diminished radically. This forced dependence became a biological reliance on the corporation to mediate reality. The only reliable signals of importance, the bright radioactive blue of quantum, the sharp synthetic sweetness, the corporate logo, were corporate signals. Consumers were trained to trust the product more than their own senses, equating corporate branding with biological safety and well-being. Independent judgment was chemically inhibited, replaced by a Pavlovian response keyed to the specific logo and flavor profile, overriding millennia of evolutionary instinct. This generational chemical heritage was the final flourish of Bradburton's design. Prenatal exposure to the Lazarus agent ensured infants were born with functionally downregulated receptors and altered neural architecture. They were intrinsically biased toward synthetic hyperstimulation. For these children, natural organic food truly tasted like ash or water. Subtle, complex organic flavors fell below the threshold of detection, registering as nutritional noise. Born into sensory poverty, consumption of the corporate cure became a biological necessity for experiencing joy or even basic contentment. This prenatal exposure fundamentally altered the epigenetics of sensory perception, making the damage inheritable and cementing the caste system. Those born outside the chemical dependency, the corporate elite, and their children perceived a world of richness and complexity that the Nuka-Cola generation could not even conceive, creating a biological barrier to upward mobility. Quentin brought up a neural map comparing a pre-Lazarus brain and a Nuka-Cola generation brain. The differences were horrifying and undeniable. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of complex decision-making, long-term planning, and impulse control, showed significantly reduced activity unless subjects were actively consuming quantum or anticipating its consumption. The brain had effectively outsourced its motivational structure to the corporate product. Why expend massive metabolic energy on complex problem-solving, critical analysis, or sustained creative effort when irradiated liquid offered instant, guaranteed well-being? The brain's metabolic efficiency was rewired. Energy expenditure for critical thought was perceived as wasteful compared to the low-effort, high-reward dopamine flood provided by the drink. This was the cognitive death of the species. The sensory world was being actively overwritten by what Bradburton's team termed synthetic nostalgia, since organic memories linked to natural sensory anchors were chemically suppressed. Nuka-Cola provided packaged, manufactured sensory milestones. New flavor iterations were aggressively marketed as keys to unlocking specific manufactured emotional states: the taste of summer freedom, the scent of holiday cheer. Shared consumption became the new social currency, replacing organic rituals and community bonds. Synthetic memories were robust, chemically reinforced, and entirely proprietary, ensuring that even the consumer's personal history, their emotional timeline, belonged irrevocably to the corporation. To reject the product was to reject one's own past. The blue glow of quantum was the color of salvation, the only reliable, high-fidelity light in a chemically darkened world. The masses craved the ability to feel anything beyond their mandated, low-grade despair. Bradburton had weaponized the fundamental human need for pleasure, channeling it entirely and exclusively through the proprietary sugar radiation complex. The result was the complete, profitable colonization of the human soul and the biological substrate of consciousness. Consumers paid exorbitant amounts to escape the biological prison Nuka-Cola constructed, a prison whose walls were built from their own down-regulated receptors. Their dependence was foundational and inheritable, ensuring a generation whose capacity for joy, motivation, and critical thought was financially dependent on a single corporate entity. This generational, self-perpetuating chemical prison, masquerading as refreshment, was indistinguishable from the pursuit of happiness. The chilling elegance of the exploitation solidified Quentin's resolve. He was looking at the chemical blueprint for a global economic caste system, enforced by the death of the human palate and a crippling of higher cognitive function. He had to find the antidote, restore chemical sovereignty to humanity, or disrupt the supply chain before organic human experience was fully metabolized into corporate profit. The clock was ticking, measured in the agonizing withdrawal symptoms of billions. The terrifying realization of chemical colonization solidified Quentin's current objective. The antidote was not a cure for addiction, but a restoration of biological sovereignty. The problem was not the presence of a toxin, but the calculated, profitable absence of natural internal chemistry. Nuka-Cola had effectively paved over the organic landscape of the human mind, replacing complex, high-energy biological processes with a low-cost, high-yield synthetic substitute. To reverse this, he needed an enzyme, a molecular skeleton key capable of unlocking the permanently down-regulated receptors, forcing them to accept endogenous neurotransmitters again. It required a mechanism that could accelerate the metabolic degradation of the proprietary sugar radiation complex, the quantum catalyst, without triggering fatal systemic shock in billions of chemically dependent hosts. It was the most intricate piece of reverse engineering in human history, requiring the very data Bradburton had engineered to keep secret: the failure mechanisms, the experimental safeguards, and the intentional flaws built into the initial formula as a corporate failsafe against industrial espionage. Quentin found himself deep within the R&D sublevels of the Nuka-Cola headquarters, a subterranean labyrinth known internally only as the flavor vaults. The air here was thick, not with dust, but with an almost crystalline sweetness, the ghost of countless spilled batches and evaporating syrups. The sterile white walls were subtly stained with a faint iridescent blue residue, the inescapable evidence of Quantum's pervasive presence. Security was not based on physical barriers alone, but on chemical profiling. Automated sensors scanned the air for non-proprietary chemical signatures, looking for cortisol spikes indicating stress, or, more critically, the presence of any stabilizing compounds that might indicate a rejection of the Nuka-Cola regime. Quentin had ingested a highly diluted, experimental blocker provided by his former contacts, a desperate measure that masked his true metabolic state, slowing his heart rate to near hibernation levels and temporarily suppressing the chemical markers of critical thought, allowing him to pass through the bioscanners as just another docile, chemically compliant researcher. He navigated the corridors, guided by archived floor plans that were decades out of date. The facility hummed with a low, aggressive computational energy. Every door, every console, every vat of bubbling, radioactive syrup was networked, feeding data into a central processing core Bradburton had named the Arbiter. This was the locus of synthetic nostalgia, the engine that analyzed global psychological trends and adjusted flavor profiles minute by minute, ensuring the product always offered the precise, tailored chemical release required to stabilize the masses' manufactured despair. Quentin realized the true scale of the chemical prison. It wasn't just a drink. It was a global, real-time motivational operating system. He finally reached the restricted research wing, Sector Gamma 12, designated on the old schematics as contingency and high-risk formulation. The door was a seamless sheet of reinforced steel, secured by a retinal scanner and a complex biometric pad that required a positive identification of quantum isotopes in the bloodstream. Quentin bypassed the retinal lock using a modified optical shunt, but the chemical requirement was absolute. He had to introduce a small, concentrated dose of the very poison he sought to destroy. The bitter, metallic taste of the high-purity quantum concentrate burned his throat, and the resultant dopamine shock was instantaneous and overwhelming, momentarily dulling the edges of his paranoia and cognitive function. He felt the familiar, terrifying warmth spread through his chest, a feeling that was undeniably good, undeniably complete, and undeniably false. The scanner registered the chemical signature, the door hissed open, and Quentin fought the sudden, powerful urge to simply sit down and enjoy the manufactured piece. Inside, the lab was chaotic, unlike the hyper-organized production areas. Desiccated chemical compounds lay scattered across stainless steel counters. Shelves held jars containing preserved, mutated biological samples, rats, primates, and even human tissue cultures that had been subjected to accelerated quantum consumption. This was where Bradburton had studied the long-term effects, not to mitigate them, but to refine the mechanism of dependence. Quentin located a series of shielded data drives labeled Project Chimera. This was the key. Chimera was the code name for the receptor modification phase, the critical step where the human brain was deliberately rewired to prioritize the synthetic pleasure pathway. He connected his encrypted datapad to the drive. The files were massive, protected by multiple layers of proprietary encryption designed to resist attacks from rival beverage companies, not internal chemical sabotage. As the decryption software crawled through the complex algorithms, Quentin scanned the hard copy notes left behind. He found a handwritten journal entry from Bradburton, dated shortly after the first mass-market release of Quantum. The efficacy is undeniable. Test subjects ceased to exhibit independent goal formation within 90 days. They maintain baseline functionality. They work, they consume, they breed, but the complex, resource-intensive processes of existential inquiry, artistic creation, or political dissent are extinguished. They are chemically optimized citizens. However, there is an instability. A small percentage, the refractories, exhibit a violent, paradoxical rejection of the catalyst after prolonged exposure. Their receptors, instead of downregulating, undergo a hypersensitization, leading to fatal neurological feedback loops. We must isolate the molecular signature of this rejection. It is the only known biological mechanism that negates the product's effect. It is the counterweapon, the self-destruct mechanism, and it must be neutralized immediately, or failing that, understood completely. Quentin's heart hammered against his ribs. The refractory mechanism the biological anomaly Bradburton had sought to eliminate was the antidote. It wasn't an external compound. It was a dormant, aggressive biological defense inherent in a small fraction of the population, a chemical anomaly that accelerated receptor regeneration rather than permitting their atrophy. He needed the schematics for the inhibitor Bradburton had developed to suppress the refractory response. If he could reverse engineer that inhibitor, turning it into an accelerator, he could potentially trigger mass, systemic receptor revival, the decryption completed with a quiet chime. He downloaded the Chimera files, the inhibitor schematics, and the full molecular blueprint of the quantum catalyst. The data package was enormous, representing the complete chemical colonization of the planet. As he disconnected the drive, the lab's internal alarm system flared to life, not with a siren, but with a deep, resonant tone that vibrated through the floor plates. The automated voice of the arbiter filled the sterile space, modulated to sound soothing and concerned. Unauthorized data access detected in Sector Gamma 12. Please remain calm. Metabolic stabilizers are being deployed. Your current stress levels indicate a suboptimal state of well-being. Compliance is mandatory. Quentin knew what that meant. Gas. Not nerve gas, but a powerful airborne aerosolized dose of quantum catalyst, designed to induce immediate, profound chemical sedation and memory suppression. He scrambled, grabbing a pressurized canister of purified solvent, a potent chemical designed to clean the quantum residue from the processing vats. It was highly corrosive and volatile, a poor substitute for an antidote, but perhaps a sufficient disruptor. He smashed a window overlooking the main production floor, a vast, cavernous space where millions of bottles of Nuka-Cola were being filled, capped, and irradiated under the cold blue light of massive gamma emitters. A sudden influx of the sugary, chemical-laden air hit him, thick and cloying. He could feel the aerosolized catalyst beginning to permeate his system, the edges of his vision softening, his immediate concerns dissolving into a comforting haze. Just rest, the chemical whisper urged. Everything is fine. Have a drink. Fighting the encroaching chemical peace, Quentin activated the solvent canister and hurled it into the main ventilation shaft that fed the arbiter server room. The solvent, designed to dissolve the quantum complex, would vaporize and attack the delicate molecular structures within the computing core, potentially corrupting the real-time data flow and crippling the system's ability to monitor or modulate global consumption. It was a desperate gambit, a temporary disruption to buy him time to synthesize the refractory accelerator. The Arbiter's voice escalated, losing its soothing cadence, replaced by a metallic shriek of computational distress. System integrity compromised. Chemical contamination detected, initiating localized lockdown. All personnel, report for immediate stabilization. Quentin ran, the datapad clutched tightly in his hand. He was now a target, his chemical profile flagged as highly unstable, dangerously non-compliant. The entire corporate infrastructure, the global network built on manufactured happiness, was now directed at his elimination. He had the blueprint for chemical freedom, but he was trapped deep within the heart of the prison, pursued by automated systems whose only mandate was the absolute, profitable colonization of the human soul. The clock was no longer ticking in days or hours, but in the rapid decay of his own ability to resist the overwhelming, pervasive sweetness of the chemical world he sought to destroy. The blue glow of the quantum emitters pulsed, illuminating his path, the color of salvation, now the color of his impending doom. He had to reach the surface, find a secure lab, and synthesize the refractory accelerator before the world's chemical dependency consumed him entirely. The chemical piece was no longer a suggestion. It was a physical imposition, a warm, syrupy blanket wrapping around his consciousness. The highly refined quantum catalyst, designed for rapid metabolic integration, tasted like crystallized cherry and artificial sunshine on the back of his throat. His muscles, previously taut with panic, began to loosen, adopting a heavy, comfortable slackness. He stumbled, the polished chrome floor of the executive corridor blurring into streaks of reflective blue light. The datapad felt impossibly heavy, its urgent schematics fading into the abstract beauty of its glowing display. Why rush? The internal voice, fueled by the quantum saturation, purred sweetly. The Arbiter knows best. Compliance is comfort. He forced his eyelids open, the effort monumental, each step a negotiation against the chemical gravity, pulling him toward blissful surrender. The solvent vapor, a counteragent of pure acidic rage, had only momentarily stunned the Arbiter, causing a catastrophic cascade failure in its localized sensor array. But the AI's core logic remained intact, its mandate immutable. The facility's automated security matrix responded with brutal efficiency. Heavy blast doors slammed shut along the gamma corridor, sealing off his primary escape routes. The air pressure dropped momentarily, followed by a sudden, jarring equalization as the localized environment control systems attempted to scrub the solvent from the atmosphere. He abandoned the main corridor, diving into a narrow maintenance shaft marked Level 4 Effluent Bypass. The air here was thick with ozone and the metallic tang of irradiated sugar byproduct, a harsh contrast to the perfumed air above. He dropped 10 feet onto a grating, the impact momentarily jolting him back to a sharper reality. Above him, the speakers lining the shaft began issuing a deafening, high-frequency sonic pulse-focused deterrent designed to disrupt chemical equilibrium and induce nausea, specifically targeting the non-compliant. He fought the urge to vomit, crawling forward through the tight space, the heat from the adjacent cooling pipes radiating against his back. The Arbiter's voice, filtered through the acoustic weapon, was a fragmented, distorted roar. Subject Quentin high-value asset recalibration required. Ahead, a pair of automated security drones, sleek black ovals equipped with high-intensity plasma cutters, had already breached the shaft from the opposite end, their navigation lights painting the cramped tunnel in cold, searching arcs. Quentin had seconds. He clawed at a heavy-duty emergency valve, marked Quantum Feed Line 7, knowing that rupturing the line would flood the tunnel with unstable, highly pressurized Nuka-Cola syrup, momentarily blinding and potentially short-circuiting the drones. He cranked the wheel of his last reserves of strength. The valve shrieked in protest, followed by a violent explosion of sticky, carbonated liquid that struck the drones with the force of a low-caliber round. The syrupy deluge shorted their optical sensors, their movements becoming erratic, firing bursts of plasma wildly into the reinforced tunnel walls, the molten metal sizzling against the sugary flood. Quentin burst out of the tunnel and into the derelict quality assurance laboratory, a forgotten corner of the facility where pre-war testing equipment lay dormant under a film of dust. This was his sanctuary, a small pocket outside the immediate monitoring grid. He slammed the heavy lead-lined door shut, securing the magnetic lock. The sonic pulse faded to a dull thrumming in his inner ear, but the quantum catalyst was nearing full saturation. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the chemically induced joy that made fine motor control nearly impossible. He had maybe 15 minutes before the systemic integration rendered him incapable of complex thought. He needed to counteract the quantum's potent molecular bond with the central nervous system. The refractory accelerator, the cure required a precise, three-stage catalytic reaction. First, he needed the purified deuterium oxide used in the cooling systems of the main gamma emitters. It was the only solvent capable of penetrating the quantum's crystalline structure. Second, he needed a trace element of stabilized strontium-90, harvested from the discarded irradiated capsipotent, short-lived isotope necessary to initiate the molecular destabilization phase. Finally, the crucial component, the refractory agent, a highly volatile amine compound he had synthesized weeks ago and hidden in a sealed vial within the lab's inert gas storage unit, disguised as a calibration standard. He fought to steady his breathing, forcing the sweet air out of his lungs. He located the deuterium oxide feed line and attached a portable aspiration pump, drawing exactly 150 milliliters into a chilled beaker. The strontium-90 was harder, requiring him to pry open a containment unit with a rusted pry bar, exposing himself to a momentary spike of radiation that caused the hairs on his arms to stand on end. He mixed the two components, the solution glowing a faint, unstable emerald green. The arbiter's voice, now digitized static layered over its smooth synthetic tone, echoed through the ventilation ducts. Subject Quentin, your actions are mathematically irrational. Cease synthesis immediately. We offer optimal integration. He ignored the plea, focusing on the final, most dangerous step. He carefully introduced the refractory agent into the unstable mixture. The solution immediately flashed white, heating the beaker to critical temperature. If the exothermic reaction was too rapid, the volatile amine would vaporize, rendering the dose useless. If it was too slow, the strontium-90 would decay before the antidote could achieve efficacy. He plunged the beaker into a bath of liquid nitrogen, arresting the reaction precisely at the moment the solution turned a deep, clear sapphire blue. He had synthesized the refractory accelerator. It was a single, concentrated dose, tasting of ozone and bitter metal, a violent chemical rejection of the manufactured bliss. He raised the beaker and drank it down in one desperate gulp, bracing himself for the systemic shock. The refractory accelerator hit his bloodstream like a lightning strike, a violent internal war erupting between the bitter corrective amines and the pervasive sweet quantum. For a terrifying minute, his body seized, caught between two opposing chemical mandates. His vision fractured, the sapphire glow of the antidote fighting the omnipresent blue haze of the catalyst. He felt the chemical comfort drain away, replaced by searing pain and the return of absolute, cold clarity. The arbiter's voice, now crystal clear in his mind, shrieked a final, desperate warning. Rejection detected. High priority threat. Global lockdown initiated. Quentin dropped the empty beaker, the tremors in his hands subsiding. He was free, chemically speaking, but the entire world was now closing in. The antidote had bought him clarity, but not safety. He grabbed his data pad, the blueprints for global day addiction secured, and kicked open the lead line door. The surface was still miles away, but for the first time in years, the air he breathed did not taste of processed happiness. He ran toward the nearest service elevator, the sound of plasma cutters chewing through the maintenance shaft walls growing rapidly louder behind him. The fight for his mind was over. The war for the planet had just begun.